Welcome to the Rideshare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
So David Zipper's perspective on cities and urban mobility is rooted in his experience working within City Hall, as well as being a venture capitalist, policy researcher, and startup advocate. David advises numerous startups, mayors, and transit agencies about the future of urban mobility. His writing has been published in The Atlantic, Slate, Newsweek, Fast Company, Bloomberg City Lab. He's covering such topics as mobility as a service, integration of transit fare payments, and the relationship between transit and ride-hail services, which is why we have him on today. You can find his articles and his whole body of work over at davidzipper.com or on Twitter at davidzipper. I think if you just type the words David Zipper into any box on the internet, you should pop up, right, David?
There aren't that many of us. We're a small clique of David Zippers out there. I think there's a couple others in like Las Vegas or something, but yeah, I may have the bigger social media profile.
Okay. So the unfortunate thing about my name is if you type Harry Campbell into the internet, there's this famous artist named, I think he's an artist named Harry Campbell, and then there's also this public speaker named Harry Campbell. So there's like two people way more famous than me. So it's a little tough, I guess good and bad, to find me when you search me.
That's the worst thing that happens in your life. You've led a good life. Let's put it that way.
I'm doing all right. Well, it's been a little while since you've been on the podcast. And, I was reading off your bio and it kind of reminded me, one of the things that I love about your perspective is that you're I feel like you're kind of rooted in the transit community, but you've done all of this work within startups, either as an advisor or, working directly. And so you can kind of merge the two, because I feel like too often, just in general in life, people sort of get into their camps and it's hard to meet in the middle. But that's really why I love your perspective and kind of why I'm excited to chat with you today.
Well, thanks. I think is this a third podcast that we've done together? I think so.
I think it is.
I'm pretty sure it is.
Right.
Yeah. I feel it feels very familiar, and in a good way. No, it's always great. I appreciate that. I actually, I sort of try hard to understand the various modes of ride hail and scooters and bikes and walking and cars too, to be able to plug them all together. And that's what leads to a topic like this with ride hail and transit being, to me, a really interesting concept. I'm looking forward to chatting about it.
Well, let's start there, because I feel like this concept of ride hail and transit is not new. I think that we have an article on our site. I don't know if you read it, but it's 3 or 4 years old, where I explored and researched. I spent a lot of time researching all of the various pilot programs at these cities, Pinellas County and, New Jersey and, Boston, San Diego, right? All of these cities, years ago, were doing little pilots with Uber and Lyft. And maybe that was when the companies were a little newer and shinier and sexier, and we didn't know about some of the negative aspects of the services. But what's the relationship been like between ride hail and transit over the years, if you want to kind of set the stage, and then we'll get into this report that was released?
Sure. So ride hail really burst on the scene 10 years ago or 12 years ago, and cities and transit agencies were caught off guard and didn't really know what to think. And you're right. I think at first there was a large amount of excitement in, say, the mid 2010s, if you will, about the idea of ride hail maybe solving a first mile, last mile problem, which is the idea of bringing people to and from transit stations. And when you refer to some of those pilots, you're probably some of them were probably funded by what was called the MOD, Mobility on Demand Sandbox program under President Obama at the Department of Transportation, like Pinellas County is an example of that. Those projects didn't do very well. They didn't show a whole lot in terms of new riders being brought. And actually, as academic research started to come out in the mid 2010s, it's been largely pretty damning of ride hail, suggesting that ride hail's emergence leads to fewer people taking transit because some just prefer transit and leave. Some just prefer ride hail and will just leave transit to take it. But also the additional congestion of ride hail vehicles can slow down bus service if there's not dedicated lanes for the buses to use. And that can just deteriorate bus service and make people choose other modes. So we can talk about that, but that's been a source of growing controversy among transit agencies. But at the same time, too, and especially in the last couple of years, Lyft and Uber have tried to sort of really align themselves with transit, saying, look, we all want congestion pricing. We love the idea of car-free living. And I think that the question becomes, how much of that is marketing and how much of that is actual real strategy.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to get into, because I'll tease my perspective, which I think that there is, some marketing, but I do think that there's a lot of, opportunity to sort of leverage the best aspects of ride hail and combine that with transit. So why don't we get into this report that was released, and actually you wrote a nice article about it over in Bloomberg City Lab, which we'll leave a link to in the show notes. I guess I'll read the official title of the report, which is always kind of interesting. Transit Horizons Toward a New Model of Public Transportation. What's on the horizon for public transportation? Okay, download this thing. Okay, so you get the gist, right?
That's the Uber.
That's the Uber title. Oh, that's not the title you use for your article.
No, but yeah, that is the name of the title of the article from Uber Transit that just came out this week.
So what's the gist? We'll definitely break into some of the specific points of the report that Uber released, but what's the gist of this report and kind of why should we care?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that is right off the bat why it was interesting to me and Uber Transit is interesting to me is it's a pretty big team, right? Like Uber did a lot of layoffs of its team last year in 2020. And it's in the report. There's well over 200 people working at Uber Transit. As far as I know, that team has stayed steady and maybe even grown a bit in the last year, which suggests to me that Uber really cares about this. It's not fluff. There's something real there. So that's part of what led me to be interested in it. It's more than just, I think, a PR, which some people write it off as. It's not.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point to dissect because I think you and I have chatted about this before. And I mean, it's sort of, a more apparent at large is that really over the past 2 or 3 years, Uber has been consolidating, right? I mean, you could sort of look at ride hail more largely globally. They've been consolidating in China was the first, then Russia, and then across the globe, really. And then also sort of knocking off these other, I kind of think, I'm curious to know what you think of them. Like, I think of them as sort of like investor candy, right? Like self-driving cars, I was always very skeptical of. There's also Uber Freight, which is still around. They've got these other business units that they've sort of, even the scooters and bikes, which, and I'm not to say I'm skeptical of all of their new initiatives, but I think some definitely look a lot shinier than the actual business prospects are.
Yeah, I think that part of what you're seeing is sort of a difference in strategies between Travis Kalanick and Dara Khosrowshahi, right? I think with the current CEO of Uber, there's he clearly he's a finance background, and he wants to really focus on what Uber is best at. And he's, I think, what I see him doing is retreating from a variety of different products that may have been flashy and exciting, but were not core to what Uber is. I think I'm paraphrasing what he would say, but not core to what he thinks Uber is best at. So yeah, you're exactly right with the AV unit. You've now, with that being unloaded to Aurora, you're seeing Uber really sort of, I think, having a strategy more aligned with what Lyft has always done, which is to say we're not going to build this ourselves. We'll instead partner with other companies that specialize. So, but what's interesting again is that's not what's happened with transit. For whatever reason, Uber Transit is staying strong as a pretty serious team while these other units get divested. So something's going on for transit to be still core.
So I think you're the guy to talk to. So what is going on? Why is Uber Transit so core to the mission of Uber right now?
Well, I think we should probably talk about what exactly they're doing, which I think
I know I'm jumping ahead, right? I'm a little excited to dig into it. All right, I know this is pretty exciting topic. I think if you're interested in the world of transit and ride hail.
Yeah, and I should say too, like you said in the beginning of the podcast, I've done a lot of work with transit agencies. I talk to a lot of transit agencies, and I do hear a lot of curiosity, but also uncertainty among transit agencies, how they should look at Uber and Lyft. They wonder if Uber and Lyft can perhaps help solve certain problems they have especially with bringing new riders in far-flung areas and in reducing the cost of service in certain places. But at the same time, too, there's just this growing cacophony of research indicating that ride hail leads to congestion that diminishes ridership of transit. So that's part of why I wrote the article that I did, is to illuminate some of those tensions. So to answer, can I maybe suggest, should we talk about what Uber Transit's doing, and then talk?
I had a good starting point, and I'll leave it up to you to decide. But I know that you talked about in your article you wrote, is that there's 3 transit products that Uber has released. So that might be a good starting point, or wherever you feel is best.
That's just what I was thinking too. It's like, great minds think alike, Harry. Yeah, so there's really 3 business units, and again, if you're interested in this, do look at the Uber report. Don't trust me to paraphrase perfectly.
Well, I guess what I would say, David, is if you're really into this, read the report. If you're kind of into this, read your article, and if you're just thinking about it, listen to this podcast.
Boom, done, nailed it. So the 3 business sort of products that Uber Transit offers, and I'm actually going to give them the names that Uber uses. There's Uber Rides for Transit, which is, like it sounds like, a transit agency can basically subsidize Uber trips. It talks about Uber X trips or Uber pool trips, which can be used for ex-urban areas that are expensive or to serve, or the quality of service is kind of crappy because the bus only goes once an hour, might be late at night. That's something that's happening in Miami right now. So that's like a core product, Uber Rides for Transit. Then there's Uber Transit software solutions. And that's where some of you on the podcast, if you follow the company closely, you'll know that Uber acquired RouteMatch last year, which is a routing software company for transit agencies. And this is a product that can be used on the back end to optimize, for example, paratransit or microtransit services. And Marin County in California is the first transit agency to use that.
So this would be, for example, if you wanted to kind of have your own Uber-like software where, you've got your own paratransit vehicles, you want to be able to have people call them with an app and all that. You go to Uber for their software, but it's still, I'm assuming, going to be a white label app under, Marin Transit County, whatever.
In Marin's case, it's actually not, because they bought more than just this. That actually is using the Uber app, but you're right that they're basically, frankly, Uber's competing with Via and a couple other companies like Transloc that can provide back-end solutions. So you might not even know that Uber's providing it. You're right.
I just read about a pilot in LA here too from a company called Rideco. So I know that there's a few out there too.
And then the third of the products that Uber Transit offers is called Uber Moss Solutions. And this is a nod to mobility as a service, a topic that I have written a lot about and have followed very closely, which you and I have talked about.
Are you tired of talking about it, or are we still going to talk about it?
Yeah, it's
never gets old.
I'm used to it. No, but mobility as a service is the idea of bringing all kinds of various modes together into one platform to make it easy to not have to drive your own personal vehicle. And what Uber is offering to do is to bring transit and potentially other modes too, like micromobility that's shared, onto the Uber app. And Denver is an example of a city where this is being done. There's a few others like Las Vegas, where at least transit tickets are available on the Uber app. So you got Uber Rides for Transit, discounted trips, Uber Transit software solutions, back-end routing software, and then Uber Moss Solutions, bringing all the products to all the various modes, into the Uber app. Those are the 3 products that are being offered.
So which product do you personally like the most? I was ready. I had this question ready to put you on the spot, David.
Harry, let me be very clear. I will answer your question because that's the right thing to do, but I have a lot of skepticism about really all of these products, which we can talk about.
Well, that's fair. I mean, that's sort of the point of my question, right? Are there any, I'm leaving it up to your interpretation, what you like the most?
I get it. I think one that actually does have some pretty powerful potential is, and I can see potential with 2 of the 3 of them, I'd say. The Uber Transit software solutions, the routing software, that could really be quite powerful to improve paratransit, which is the service for those with disabilities. It's terrible. People who have disabilities and rely on paratransit, they hate it. And
it's also expensive, right? Isn't it like $40 to $50 a ride?
It is expensive. It is. This could be really, really good. So I think that has real potential. And the other one that I think has potential, and this is something that's more nuanced than I could really get into in the article, I think in certain situations, Uber rides for transit, which I think is probably the one that Uber cares the most about, subsidized Uber trips. In very specific situations, I could see it being valuable. And what I mean by that is it's valuable, or it can be valuable, I would think, if you're talking about a transit agency that really is focused solely on a rural area where there's just not the density of demand to justify fixed route bus service. It's just going to be too expensive. And then the idea of subsidizing Uber trips, I see the value there. Now, I think it's very dangerous if you start doing this in a larger urban area where you're taking dollars, taxpayer dollars or fare payment dollars away from core downtown or center city or inner suburb service. That I think is way riskier. But I do see the value in something like there's an example of Innisfil, Ontario, where this service is available. It's an exurb of Toronto. And I've spoken to leaders there, and they see that they're like, we could never justify having fixed route bus service. We really think this is the only way to do it. And it's worked out quite well for us, and people seem to like it, and we're golden. So those are what I'd say are a couple opportunities from these products.
Let's start with the Uber rides for transit, the sort of subsidized Uber trips. I like the way you put that. And I think that this is an interesting concept. I think you actually brought this up in your article, though, that there is this sort of potential downside, right? I mean, it's going to be really nice. Like, wouldn't you rather take an Uber, than a bus at night if it's subsidized? That it could sort of induce a lot of extra demand, right? And so you have to sort of think about, like, I like the way you put it in the urban, or sort of in the more rural areas where there isn't going to be, thousands of people requesting rides, right? Versus the urban areas where there sort of is. Can you?
This is really
important. Can you explain that concept a little? Because I sort of butchered it.
Yeah. No, not at all. No, this is actually, I think, a really important issue that Uber understands. They actually mentioned it in their report. But they talk a lot about how there's money to be saved for transit agencies if they substitute relatively low demand routes for, they get rid of those and instead use subsidized UberX or Uber Pool trips. And on a per trip basis right now, they may well be right, but it's kind of intuitive. The problem I was flagging in the article and what you're alluding to now, which is, to say we're all human beings. Would we rather have a bus service that goes once per hour and makes lots of stops that we have to walk to the station, then walk from the station to where we're going, versus getting a point-to-point trip on Uber Pool or UberX, where we're picked up where we are, more or less, we're dropped off where we're going with few stops along the way, if any at all. It's obviously more convenient for everyone to do the latter. The thing is, once you make something more convenient, more people are going to take trips. Maybe before you're like, you know what? The bus is a hassle. I don't want to take the trip. I just won't go at all, or I'll drive or whatever. But now, hey, look, it's a subsidized UberX trip. I'm going to take a trip that I might not have otherwise taken, or I'll take that instead of driving. That's what's called induced demand. And when that happens, these are all variable costs. It's going to lead to more and more taxpayer dollars having to be spent to subsidize those trips. And if you have a fixed budget, as most transit agencies do, you run the risk of blowing through your budget, frankly. And then you have to put a cap on the number of trips that somebody can take that are subsidized, or you have to freeze the program where you can sign up. This is a problem that's come up in Pinellas County, where you were mentioning, in St. Petersburg, Florida. They have an impressive program to provide subsidized ride-hail commutes at night when transit's not running to low-income workers. It's so popular that they had to freeze the program to new applicants for a while, which feels kind of antithetical to how transit's supposed to work, where it's like open to everybody that would want to use it. But the key thing here is that ride-hail is based on variable costs, the driver and the vehicle, as opposed to the fixed costs of a bus, where you've got the empty seats. And more people riding means they just go sit down, and there's really not very much extra cost to the agency when people are going to board that
Yeah.
bus.
So it's
Does
that's a
that make
great
sense?
explanation, and I think it's really a change in thinking, right? Because if you've been in the transit community your whole life, you're thinking about those fixed costs, right? The more people we can get onto this bus, right, the more efficient it is. And with ride hail, it's basically the opposite, right? It's really sort of a
It's
180.
just
Yeah,
steady.
it's really a
Yeah.
180 way of thinking, and so it seems like this Uber Rides for Transit product has potential in rural areas where there isn't that density of demand. I'm trying to think though, is there a great solution in urban areas? Because, for example, one of the reasons where I've always, enjoyed my perspective as an actual, having actually driven for Uber in the past, because I've literally picked up people at the bus stop at 2 or 3 a.m. at night, in the middle of all these bar runs, and they, couldn't get a bus home, right? And this is a little bit of an anecdotal story, but you can kind of imagine, right? In the later hours, the frequency isn't as good, it's not as reliable, and sometimes people just want to get home. And that seems like a great use case to subsidize, but I'm not sure if there's a way to do it that avoids some of the pitfalls you mentioned in a more urban area.
So yeah, yeah. So in an urban area, I mean, I can see some value in that. The idea being like you're taking people away from drunk driving, frankly, also. There's a social value in that. Um,
But I think what you don't want to
you know,
do is
and
subsidize a bunch of people like going to the bars, right?
um, I think that's right. But I think, I mean, it's interesting. One of the studies that is complementary of ride hail that I've seen shows that when ride hail emerges in a city, you actually see you see fewer DUIs, drunk driving involved crashes and things like that, which is sort of intuitive, and it's something that I think we should credit ride hail for, and that's a social goal. So I don't actually worry too much about providing making it convenient for people to not drive themselves through ride hail subsidy, and I worry less, I guess, about the induced demand there. What I am concerned about is more when I see a transit agency thinking about saying, oh, let's provide subsidized Uber trips instead of fixed route bus in this suburban area. And I'm like, you know what? Those marginal dollars might be better spent. They could serve more people if you add frequency of service downtown. And the challenge is people who really like microtransit, it's often made available to those who are more affluent. It creates equity issues, which I consider to be problematic.
Interesting. Okay, so I think we've spent enough. We could probably spend more time on the Uber rides for transit. I have a few more questions, but I'm going to leave them alone for now because I wanted to bring this up. I thought it was a little funny that you mentioned Uber Transit Software Solutions as the product you like most, because it's actually the product I like least. So I'm curious to understand why you think it's the best. The reason why I think it's valuable, but I think that there are a number of companies now offering this. I mean, I've literally interviewed people on my podcast. I think in episode actually 49, George Grama, he's building ride hail software and now white labeling it to private companies, public. I don't think he's working with transit agencies, but this is the app, the technology side of things is actually very much a commodity product these days, right? So like the Uber app itself today is not that valuable in a sense, right? Like obviously the network of drivers they built and passengers is what's valuable. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why you like the transit software solutions, which I think you described as agencies can sort of purchase Uber's routing software, right?
Yeah, we get access to it. Yeah, I think the reason I like it is that it's going after a real need. I am not totally convinced that some of these other products are addressing a real need, especially Uber Moss solutions. But if you talk to people who use a wheelchair about their experience using the traditional paratransit service, they talk about having to call a day ahead or 2 days ahead, it's very unreliable when the vehicle arrives. They truly hate it. And now, to be honest, Harry, there's an uncomfortable reality here, which transit agencies don't like to talk about on the record. But if you make these trips will always be subsidized. They are subsidized with Uber. They're subsidized with anybody else. And if you make it more convenient, again, induced demand means more people will request it, and that could blow up budgets again. It's just that I personally believe there is a social
sort of the right thing to
need to provide basic mobility. Yeah. So if people are genuinely suffering from limited mobility, if we can improve their ability to get around, that's a wonderful thing. And to your point, are there other solutions to potentially do this? Yeah, possibly. And I am agnostic as to, I'm not going to endorse Uber Transit software solutions over others, but I certainly think this is an exciting place for technology to improve transit service.
I think we agree on solving the basic problem. Then I kind of definitely agree is that, I don't honestly know as well. I can kind of imagine all of the issues with paratransit rides right now, and you're sort of confirming a lot of what I suspected in my head. And so it does seem like a very noble goal to solve. I'm just not convinced that Uber is, the best solution. I actually have no idea what it would cost to implement. And so I guess my advice there would just be to understand that there are other options out there. And if Uber is the best option, I'm thinking probably because they provide the best support or because they provide the best price, right? But like the actual software product here, I can't imagine it's going to be head and shoulders above, someone else, unless there is an interesting kind of component of being able to book it in the Uber app, because I think that's one thing that leads into the MOS solutions, right? I think you mentioned the, was it, the Marin County, right? If you can book a paratransit ride on the Uber app, then that is kind of interesting to me.
And that's what they want to do. I mean, the report that Uber put out says that these services or these products are available individually, but they work best as a package. So clearly Uber wants to find transit agencies that want everything, so they can integrate everything. You're exactly right. And Marin County is, I'm thinking with Marin. Now, Marin does not offer transit tickets on the Uber app right now. They might in the future, but they do the Uber rides for transit combined with the Uber Transit software solutions.
Got it. Okay. So for the Uber MOS solutions, I think this is actually one where I actually think there's the most opportunity here. So it's funny that I like disagreeing with you, because then we end up agreeing. But I feel like
wait, we end up agreeing?
I think we kind of ended up agreeing on the first 2 points.
Oh, that's what you mean.
Okay, so Uber MOS. All right, let's talk about this last one. I think actually the first last mile opportunity is interesting. I guess I'm skeptical that, you're going to be able to hop off a bus, for example, or a train in like the middle of a downtown area and get into an Uber at like peak, 5 p.m. rush hour when Uber is surging and there's all this like kind of chaos going on. But I like a lot of these integrations between public transit and Uber app, basically, right? Like I think that a lot of these agencies are, they're trying to get people to download their own app. And, like I saw some app the other day, or like, LA one is called like the LA Micro Transit, Authority, some weird, like how many people are going to download this app? Whereas everybody has the Uber app, right? And so like, why not leverage some of those strengths? Lyft in San Diego, we'll talk about Lyft for a second. Lyft just announced a little partnership with the city of San Diego, I think just yesterday or the day before, where you can now see transit times in the Lyft app, which I think is now kind of cool, because you see I can call a Lyft and get there in 15 minutes and it'll cost, $20, or I can wait 20 minutes and I'll get there a little slower on a bus, most likely, or a comparable amount of time, and it's going to be a lot cheaper. It seems like a lot of those integrations are interesting to me. I'm curious to get your thoughts, though.
I have many thoughts. First, I should just note that the whole idea of first mile, last mile solutions through ride hail, it's not really worked. The idea of people taking ride hail to get to or from a transit station. In very limited circumstances involving commuter rail, it might, when you have
a good point,
real difficulty with parking at the commuter rail station or parking downtown. Like, for example, like some of the outer BART stations in the Bay Area could be a good place for first mile, last mile ride hail solutions. But by and large, those pilot projects from a while ago,
I think I was sort of being nice about it. I think it's a pretty terrible solution to first, last mile actual rides. And because that's the other thing, right? When you, like, I've seen it from the driver's side, like actually trying to pick someone up from a train, or, take a train and then call the Uber. So it's like quite a nightmare.
Yeah, it doesn't work for anybody. And there's something as an interesting study that just came out recently, put together by a team led by Susan Shaheen, who you probably know, a very well-regarded Berkeley professor, who was pulling together information we know about various forms of shared mobility. And there's a great table there showing that what mode most of us use who take transit, most of us use to solve the first mile, last mile problem. We use our own 2 feet. Yeah, it's over 91% of trips. Ride hail is less than 1%. Ride hail plus taxi is collectively less than 1%. So anyway, maybe it's a little bit of a diversion, but I wanted to underscore that the whole first mile, last mile thing ain't working for ride hail. Now, but with Uber MaaS solutions, one of the reasons I'm deeply skeptical about it is that I'm not sure what transit agencies really gain from being able to sell tickets within the Uber app. I think it's nice for Uber to be able to offer that. They can get closer to the CEO's vision of being an Amazon of transportation. But what data is going to be shared with the transit agency about the origins and destinations requested? Uber's been very cagey about talking about that. How will transit be represented within the Uber app? Because you and I both know, as do your listeners, that Uber is going to make more money if the marginal rider opts for a ride-hail trip instead of a transit trip. So even if Uber doesn't act on that incentive, they have a financial incentive to nudge through all the various ways that they can. They're very good at nudging, Uber is.
Yes.
Nudge people
just try being a driver and then you'll see that the nudges are
I was just thinking of that. No, totally. This is what they specialize in. So even if they're not acting on it, this is something that I'm concerned about. And then also, I guess I just question the from a societal perspective or a transit perspective. Transit agencies are moving toward wanting to be mobility managers and encourage people to bike and walk and use bike share and scooters, even if the transit agency isn't providing that service itself. But the problem then is when you think about Uber as your MaaS solution, for many cities, there's modes that will never be available in the Uber app. Like, for example, in New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Chicago, those are examples of a few cities where you'll never have bike share available on the Uber app because you know who manages the bike share system in those cities? It's Lyft. Lyft is never going to want to nudge people or encourage people to use the Uber app. So you're never going to have an Uber MaaS solution that actually offers all of the major modes that are alternatives to driving. So this is a solution where I have the most skepticism, and it's also the one where, frankly, there's the least evidence of benefit. I've sought data anywhere about Uber MaaS solutions leading to more transit ridership, which is what they sort of dangle as the opportunity. I've never found it. So maybe I'll get that data. If any of your listeners have it, by all means, let me know. But not yet.
So if anyone wants to leak some data to David Zipper, you know how to contact him.
I accept leaks and I maintain confidentiality.
Yeah, he'll never reveal a source. I can agree to that. I can confirm that. So let's step back. I mean, what is the main goal right now of a transit agency? Like, I think before we get ahead of ourselves and think about like, okay, transit and Uber should partner, like what is the issue or the opportunity that transit agencies have right now? And then we can talk about how Uber might solve, like, what's their biggest problem right now?
Well, the problem right now is getting people to ride transit again after COVID. They got to survive.
Okay. They need money
to be able to,
and they need more, I guess, riders and more money.
They need to attract people back to their core product. Because, once we're all vaccinated, God willing, there's going to be a lot of people making decisions about how they're going to travel, especially in bigger cities. And those decisions might look different than what they were in February of 2020 pre-COVID. And it's very important for transit that as many people as possible, when they sort of like decide their new commuting patterns, because we do get locked into our habits with commuting, by the way, as many people as possible opt to take transit again. And I'm just not sure that that's a priority to Uber.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure that it is.
Well,
now the funding piece actually could be. I actually think one area where they have aligned values is in congestion pricing, because that's something that it nudges people toward both ride hail and transit when it's adopted, as it probably will be very soon in the New York City area.
Got it. So I think that I mean, I guess so, like with a, MOS solution from Uber, it sounds like really the main potential, or sort of what Uber is touting, is that you integrate with us and we're going to send you more riders, basically, right? So, I mean, I don't think it could hurt them, right? If you sort of ignore the costs of getting set up and.
Oh, I don't know, Harry. I don't know about that. Like, it's very, like, think about just from a private sector perspective. It's so important to have the platform that interfaces with the customer.
Yeah.
You think about like, my favorite example is Vancouver, which offered a wearable transit pass. It's like a bracelet. And when those were offered, their Compass bracelet, there were lines around the blocks to get one. That really creates like loyalty to a brand, which is loyalty to the transit agency. And then the transit agency interacts directly with its customers and blah, blah, blah. There's a cost, I think, to a transit agency when it sort of allows Uber or Lyft or anybody else to disintermediate the transit agency from the rider herself or himself. So I would not necessarily agree with you that there's no real downside.
Well, let's look at, the city that I'm in, LA, right? Every time I want to ride the metro here, I have to buy what they call as a tap card, right? Because I have like 15 in my house, but I always forget it when I need to go on there, right? And so you sort of are running to the train and, you have to fill up your tap card really quickly before you get on. I mean, so I feel, and LA is obviously a pretty big city. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that they have an app where you can, pay and book these trips. And so I imagine that, even that basic level of technology, right, isn't available in a lot of transit authorities right now. So, I mean, just being able to pay, to sort of pay for a ticket on the Uber app seems like a positive to me, right? I don't know that it would outweigh some of the negatives, but I mean, doesn't that seem like a pretty big leap forward in technology?
I don't know. I don't know the specifics of how LA. I know you cannot buy a LA Metro ticket on the Uber app right now.
Oh no, I know you can't, but I'm just saying, like, I'm just thinking about it, like, because I guess here, like in this situation, you do have to weigh the positives and the negatives. I definitely agree that there are, the big negative is that you don't have control over. I mean, I run my own media business. Like, I don't want people going onto Facebook and then reading my articles. I want them on my email list, right, and reading my articles, right. I want them directly. That's sort of like business 101, to be honest. You want to own your customers and have, no intermediary in between. Otherwise, there's a huge risk. So I understand that piece of things. But in this scenario, I think that there are some positives, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I'm trying, I guess, I don't know, have there been any pilots or experiments where, we're trying to see if the positives outweigh the negatives, or is that the data that you're looking for?
I would love to find data about the benefits to Denver or Las Vegas or these other agencies that allow for transit tickets to be purchased on the Uber app.
How many tickets have been purchased? How many were?
Well, how many people would have? And especially if there's a way to do an academic study, this is really the gold standard, where you have, a control group to see, like, does the Uber app actually nudge people to take transit who wouldn't have otherwise done so? That's the promise, but there's no evidence of it yet. And Harry, I'll meet you in Los Angeles where you are, and challenge you further, because there's a very sophisticated team at LA Metro that is working on really positioning LA Metro as a mobility manager and encouraging people to bike and walk and take other modes rather than drive. And they're actually working with the behavioral economics group out of Harvard and some other universities to look at multimodal nudges and rewards, which of course they're going to need to administer directly to the riders through the LA Metro app or something like that. If hypothetically Uber were to be managing the relationship with people riding LA Metro, how would LA Metro be able to run those experiments to encourage people to ride the modes that LA Metro wants? And by the way, LA Metro may prefer people to walk and bike, while Uber's like, actually, that's good for the planet, but we don't make any money from that.
Well,
I mean, this is just the reality of the incentives.
And so I think you brought up two good points. So the data piece, right? I mean, there are ways, if you sort of have enough power, you can negotiate for data back on your customers. I mean, a good example in the food delivery world is that a lot of these mom and pop shops they don't like the food delivery apps for a lot of reasons, but one of the things they don't like is that they don't know who's ordering. They don't know if it's, a repeat customer, although Uber Eats just released a couple cool features around that. I just interviewed one of their guys, but, in general, you don't know about that data. But when you place an order from Starbucks on Uber Eats, there's a little box that you can check that says, send my data to Starbucks, right? Because Starbucks can negotiate with Uber Eats and say, hey, we're not going to be on your app unless you tell us who's ordering, what their profile is, whatever the data is that they want on their customers, right? And so you could sort of see that in that situation, it does make sense. So I think there are solutions to that first data problem. You just have to kind of know what's available. And that's why I think it's so important to sort of study these apps and these other verticals, because if you go and ask Uber for something that's completely, outside of what is possible, then it, isn't realistic. But like asking for data on your customers they're literally doing it in the Uber Eats app right now.
So that's really interesting, your example with Starbucks. And I guess what I would say is, in that way, I would encourage transit agencies to be more like Starbucks and negotiate carefully to get access to the data that they want. And I can tell you right now, from my experience, I'm not at all convinced that that's happening. I think
I don't even think they know that option is available to them, right? And I think that's what's really important to understand when you're dealing with tech companies, right? They've got these intense, they've got product roadmaps and features and all this, right? And if you go and ask them for something they've never even thought of, or that's way down on their priority list, right? It's not nearly as feasible if you're asking for features or products that already exist or are similar to things that they've already built, right? And so I think that's a good, I'm not saying it'll work. It may still not work, but or it may still not be the data you need. But I think something like that is on the table. And I would definitely, kind of agree with your recommendation that they should look for that. And then I guess the second issue, what was the second issue you brought up? There was the data and then the
multimodal nudges.
Oh, so the nudges, right? Like this is a very good point. I mean, we have partners that have partnered with Uber, for example, and it's great because you get, if you're a partner of Uber, you get free lead gen often, right? You're in the Uber driver app, you're in the Uber passenger app, and when they turn that spout on, it's great, but you have no control over it, right? So if they turn it off and you've been doing all your quarterly planning and forecasting based on these numbers, you're basically, almost worse off than you would have been without that partnership. And so I think it is important, again, to sort of negotiate, how, Uber isn't making changes to the passenger app like left and right. Like whenever they make changes to the app, this is like a huge thing, like a redesign of this and that, and they put X here and pool here. And so I think you just kind of have to negotiate your spot and, sort of understand that they can't mess with it for the duration of the contract, or, again, I think it just kind of comes down to negotiating what your position is going to be.
And this is a common theme that if there's transit agency officials listening to this, you got to negotiate. You can't just sign the contract when you're first shown it. And to be honest, anecdotally, I worry that too many agencies are signing too quickly without thinking about the leverage they might have.
No, I think that they have a lot of leverage in this situation. Because as you said, I mean, Uber, again, right, like they're devoting a lot of resources here, so they obviously want this to work, and it's kind of a big focus of the company, right?
I think that that's totally, it is a clear focus of the company. It is, and I think it's going to be interesting to watch this all go through. I think the one thing we didn't talk about in this conversation, which I think is really important, and frankly, Uber doesn't want to talk about with transit agencies, but I'm going to make us talk about it because it's important. But it's the focus really is with the Uber transit team is on these low density routes. And they're not really talking about what's happening in the downtown core, because that's not where they see themselves providing the Uber rides for transit product and or even necessarily really focusing on the software solutions product. But this is so fundamental. The reason why you're seeing so much of a backlash in the last few years from transit in many circles against Uber is because the majority of trips are happening in downtown areas.
Definitely.
There's a lot of evidence.
I think it's a given at this point.
Yeah. But this really matters because that's creating congestion and it's also just taking people away from the best transit service in a city, whether it's bus or rail. You're going to have the most dense, most frequent service downtown. And then also with the additional congestion with deadheading and whatnot, that slows down bus service, which drives further people away from buses.
But I think
there's a lot of
counter argument to this, right?
What's your counter
Well,
argument?
so the counter argument to this is when, you look at the overall numbers of ride hail, even in, like sort of their most busy city, like San Francisco, I believe there's still like 10 to 12 or maybe 15% of the overall vehicles or, sort of miles traveled in these downtown centers, right? There, we have an article on our site, I think we titled as Uber and Lyft, causing congestion. And when you look at sort of the overall numbers, it's often, very, if you look at additively, right? Like, okay, in the past 5 years, Uber and Lyft are like 2/3 of the increase in traffic or 1/2, right? But overall, they're a very small proportion in some cities like LA and Chicago and bigger, but it's still single digits often, in a lot of these really big cities. And so I think that gets more to the point where this is kind of the Uber argument, is that they're okay with, regulation and things like that as long as it's applied equally to every car, right? Which is kind of more the camp that I fall in, right? If you're going to target Uber for the congestion they're causing, right? Like apply congestion pricing to every vehicle, not just, single out Uber and Lyft, which is kind of what I feel.
Well, that is definitely what Uber and Lyft argue, is they say, like, don't just single out ride hail, apply it to everyone. However, I think that there is, put it this way, if you're going to be driving around in your own vehicle, you're going to be going where you want to go and then going back home. You're not going to be driving aimlessly. And that's what deadheading is. If you're driving around waiting for your next customer, what have you, those are wasted miles.
But cities also haven't done anything to basically implement, new waiting zones or change parking lots, right? A lot of it's actually more effective for a driver to not be aimlessly driving around. They want to pull over, they want to park, right? But if you're driving in a downtown city center, there's nowhere to park, there's nowhere to pull over, right? There's no waiting lot. So, obviously, I think, we don't need to spend forever on this, but I think we both probably have a lot of counterpoints, but I feel like, there's definitely some responsibility in the cities. I mean, Uber and Lyft have been around for 10 years. They haven't built a single waiting lot or changed much, parking and, to allow for some of these, enhanced operations, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I guess from a city perspective, I think the question that I would have is, like, is that necessarily the best use of very valuable real estate? I will say that I have more sympathy and empathy for the idea of creating passenger drop-off and pickup zones at curbside, which can reduce double parking and circling, and especially it actually can also be safe. If it happens in places with a lot of nightlife, people are drunk sometimes and wandering.
And to be fair to cities, there have been some pilots around pickup and drop-off zones: Culver City, San Diego, San Francisco, DC, where I live. There's definitely some things happening, but I guess for me, like, this is a 10-year-old industry. This isn't like, I feel the number of pilots and sort of changes that have happened in some of these sort of like low-hanging fruits. I think there could be a lot more.
Fair enough. Well, I hope that people will you can see my article for where I go into a bit more detail into all these points, and you frankly can look at Uber's report, where it's a very like slick report, and they I tried to be as fair as I could to it in the article that I wrote, but it's the clearest articulation I've ever seen of how a ride-hail company really wants to work with transit. That's really why I wanted to explore it and get into it, because I think it is an interesting topic. And some people write this all off as fluff, as PR. I don't think it's that. I think Uber actually sees this as more strategic than that.
Well, and I think that, just to put a cherry on top, and then I'll let you go, is that it's sort of feeds into the question, kind of what you talk about in the article, is Uber a competitor with public transit, right? And I think that, I don't see them as, of course, there's going to be sort of short-term competition, like you said, right? Like, are they going to nudge passengers toward rides or towards transit? I think that's a little bit of a short-term way of thinking. I think that there are a lot more long-term goals that are aligned, right? Like, really what Uber wants is, the same thing. The long-term goals of transit and Uber, I think, are very aligned. Less, people get out of their personal vehicles and into Ubers, into public transit, right? When you go from, driving your own car everywhere and taking one or two Uber rides here and there, maybe a transit ride here and there, you get rid of your car. Public transit is actually probably going to be the majority winner in that case, because, like, they're just mathematically, they can only, Uber can only do so many trips.
Well, can I disagree with you just one more time for the record?
Let's end on a disagreement, so you'll come back.
I don't think the data bears that out, Harry. There's a study that just came out from a number of researchers at Carnegie
Yeah.
Mellon that concluded that when ride hail enters a market, not just Uber but Lyft too, the number of car
Yeah,
sales
I agree.
increases.
I saw that report, I read it, and that's today, right? And I'm talking about long-term goals, right? Because in a lot of cities today, I mean, there may not be enough mobility, right? It's not just about Uber and transit, right? I think that we're talking long-term goals here, right? And I'm not saying that you should do everything to accommodate Uber's long-term goals, but I think their long-term goals are more aligned than their short-term, is maybe sort of a way of putting it too.
Maybe. I don't know. I think I'm not sure. I think I
Maybe I'm
quoted
being
in
too
the article.
optimistic.
Well, I quoted it. I have a pretty
Yeah,
spicy
at the end.
quote at the end of the article from a professor at University of Kentucky, Greg Earhart, who has researched ride hail and transit extensively, who basically says, like, look, to be honest, if I'm a transit agency exec, the ride hail is trying to put me out of business. So there may be very specific ways where we can partner, but if my service is bad, ride hail is going to do marginally better.
Yeah, I don't really agree with
And
that
it's
quote
fun.
at all, because I think that, like,
That's the one that pissed off Uber,
well,
by the way. That's the one thing I've heard Uber
I
people
mean,
be like, "Oh,
I
come
mean,
on."
frankly, I don't think it's true. I mean, frankly, I think that's like a big misconception. I mean, let's be honest, right? Like, if you look at the socioeconomic status of most people riding public transit, it's very different than Uber and Lyft, right? So to say that, they're siphoning off my customers, I mean, that's not really true. Like, if you just look at it from like a pure, like socioeconomic status, right? For the most part.
I,
I mean, if you went and graphed the
I actually,
backgrounds of like the average Uber and Lyft rider and compared to public transit, you think that they're going to be anywhere close?
no, I don't think they're going to
Okay.
be close. But I do think that when transit service
Hmm.
deteriorates in a city because there's more congestion, so
Yeah.
buses take longer, or there's more delays, less reliability, whatever. People are going to look for every other way to
Yeah.
get around, and some of those people will end up opting for ride hail. Maybe it'll be once a week, not a regular
Yeah.
everyday commuting experience, but that does happen. I've taken Uber Pool
Yep.
trips and myself where I'm with people who have basic jobs. In the certain not I shouldn't say basic. Excuse me. Strike that actually
We
if you
will.
could. I've taken Uber Pool. Trips before with people who are working and doing
Yeah.
cleaning work or something like that, and they like a couple days a week they're going to be taking a shared ride hail trip to get home. If transit service was more robust, they'd be doing that. But there are gaps, even in a city like DC that has a pretty good transit service compared to most places. So I'm not so sure. I think that if transit gets worse, in some ways that's not a terrible thing for ride hail. I hate to say it, but I do think there's an argument there, and it's something that I don't know. I am trying to be as
Yeah.
open-minded as I can about the relationship between ride hail and transit, but it is nuanced, and I think my where I come down in the end is to just recognize that Uber's as a private company, or excuse me, Uber is a public
Hmm.
company. It's going to be pursuing the bottom line, and transit agencies should do the same, regardless of what Uber may say about
Right.
partnership and what have you. Like,
And so,
it's on a transit agency to be very careful about how they
yeah.
think
And I
about
guess
this.
like where I see, like, what I want is sort of like enhanced opportunities across both services, right? Like, I don't want, sort of public transit trying to, sort of kneecap Uber so that they're competitors, right? Like, I want to be able, for them to have dedicated bus lanes everywhere. Like, I want public transit to do everything they can to enhance their service, if that makes sense, versus like sort of either, vice versa, right? Like Uber trying to kneecap transit or vice versa, right? Like, I still think there are a lot of opportunities to enhance. And I'm here in LA, which like I know that there's a lot happening transit wise, but still, like, you can take the Expo line from Santa Monica to downtown. It's not even timed with the lights, right? So it literally takes longer, on the Expo line than it would sitting in traffic in an Uber, right? And it goes slow. I saw an
Right,
article in the LA
right.
Times. The Expo line goes slower today than it did in like 1913, right? So, right?
Is that
Like, I
right?
think that there's a lot of opportunity, frankly, to like enhance public transit, and I think that would be
Hmm.
beneficial for everyone. So, I'll give you the
Great.
last word. If there's anything you want to say, you can let people, give the last word, let people know where they can find you, and we'll keep an eye on all of this relationship between TNCs and transit. It's definitely interesting.
No, no, absolutely. No, I think I'll just say that I think it's really important to discuss these topics directly. Like, I appreciate you pushing back against me and vice versa. But I guess if I have one final word, I would just really encourage transit agencies to be very deliberate and thoughtful about the partnerships they enter into. I sometimes worry that they just simply sign because they're excited to be working with a trendy San Francisco-based company. And I think we agree on that.
Definitely.
So if people disagree with me, then you can direct your explanations of what I've gotten wrong to me on Twitter. I suppose you can message me. I'm at David Zipper, and I may have referenced some articles I've written in the past about ride hail and transit. I've written a lot in various publications, and they're all those articles are available at David Zipper. But yeah, just thanks, Harry. I always appreciate the chance to chat with you about these topics, and I'm glad you care about transit. I know you've had Jarrett Walker on here before. I hope you'll have many other transit leaders too.
I think I've been doing 6 years of shows, had many of the great transit leaders, and through all of that, I've learned one good term: induced demand. So it's definitely paying off. I don't know if you heard me use that earlier in the podcast, but
did
took me quite a few interviews to learn that. But appreciate it as always, David. We'll leave links in the show notes to the work that you've been doing, how to find you on Twitter, and all that good stuff. All right, take care.